Hi, this is Ruth, a friend of mine, and she's bought me this top which is gaping here, but I also noticed that this seam here is forward a little bit. So what I'd like to do is, before we do that, I'd like to just pin the shoulders. Now what I like to do is have the pin head so that the sharp piece is away from the person's neckline. So I'm just going to lift that up and place the pin in, and a second one like that. So basically what I'm going to do is just come through here to the very edge. I will undo this seam so that when I take it in, and then I'll put that seam back again. And then when you pin the other side, you want to come around here so that you want the pin head to go away from their neckline again. Put that there like that. And also, because when they get it off and they pull it over their head, you know, you don't want that sharp bit to poke into them. And then the last thing to do is just to come here, and Ruth, just want to ask the question, did you want the gathering just in the middle?
No.
Or all the way across?
All the way.
All the way across? Great, okay. So all we have to do then is just get this sitting so we know that that's just going to sit like that. That'll be the length that we want with the elastic in it. So I'll just come over here. Again, I'm putting the pin head so it's away from Ruth's skin, pointing down, but that just shows me that's how wide it's going to be. And that's done.
So the first step that you need when you're preparing something like this is to transfer the measurements of the pins onto a piece of paper. So I've just highlighted there for you in the top right hand corner. So the amount that it was pinned at the top was 5/8 of an inch, and then it just tapered off to the sleeve. So you really don't need any other measurements other than that. And of course you want to take that measurement across the front and write that down on a piece of paper so you don't forget. Now you'll notice that this top, when they've sewn the shoulder seams, they've just gone straight through, overlocked straight through, nothing's turned back. So it's, you know, I guess I would tend to say it's a bit rough. And so when they do that, they bar tack it, you know, they just stitch that seam down. So whenever you come across this sort of thing, obviously you've got to release that bar tack so you can get to the seam. The way that they'd put the elastic in, I needed to unpick the whole thing because some of it had caught with the elastic and things like that, so it was just easier to unpick it, and then I'll just restitch it and thread the elastic in. So I'm actually going to undo this section here as well so that I can thread the elastic through from one side to the other, because she said she'd prefer it to be all the way across rather than, you know, the way it was, which was just in the middle. But what I just wanted to point out here is that when you're trying to get access to a seam like that, which you know I need to do, this has been top stitched down. So obviously what you need to do is just undo that little bit of top stitching first so that you can then get to that main seam. And I've seen a few people do clothing alterations, and you know, they don't undo top stitching, or they don't undo under stitching, and they try and get to the seam, and then they can't, but they still stitch it anyway, and of course then it all puckers. So you always want to think of clothing alterations as working backwards. So what was the last thing sewn is the first thing that you want to unpick. Now, when you're taking in something like this at the shoulder, and you're bringing the front and the back panels together, you may find that the back panel might be bigger or smaller depending on the the pattern. What you can do is ease it in, and I'm going to do that with this. That whole section there had been torn, as I think you saw, so I've kind of unpicked all of that and then repinned it so that then I can take it in the amount that I want to take it in. But it's also got that little section that's over the top. I've got to make sure that that's sitting flat as well. But you can ease it in, and you can do it in such a way that you shouldn't get any puckering or gathering. I'll show you when I'm stitching it what I mean. But it is important, obviously, to pin those edges together so that when it's stitched and it's turned back, the front and the back panel are equal. If they're not equal, it's going to look wrong. And lastly, when you're doing something like this and you're stitching from the shoulder to the top of the armhole, always unpick, like I'm doing now, that seam that is attached to the armhole so that you have direct access to that seam, so you can start at the top, the shoulder, and go straight through in a really nice straight line, and you can finish at the top of the armhole. And when that's stitched down, it'll sit beautifully. So you can see there that I'm just starting at the very edge, making sure obviously that the front and the back panels are even, so that when it's turned back I can just move it over and bar tack it. The fabric had stretched slightly. See how I've got that pin, and I'm just pushing the pin in underneath the foot as I go, and I've lifted the foot, dropped the foot, so that pin helps me ease. You can ease a fair amount of fabric this way, and as long as you don't gather it or pucker it. So you can see there's the easing, but then when that's ironed, you can't even see the easing at all, right? Because the iron will just flatten it out. So doing the same with the other side. If you do have a garment like this and it's fairly bulky, you'll find a video in my YouTube channel which shows how to actually do this for a bulky seam. You know, if you don't have an overlocker, and if you are a sewer, I know that you obviously would love one. You know, you can pick one up second hand. I've picked up overlockers for, $200 second hand, and the only thing that was wrong with them was that it wasn't threaded properly because people didn't know how to thread it. I remember picking up an $850 overlocker for $200 or something like that because she didn't know how to work it, and couldn't sell it. Now I'm using my loop turner there because this is stitched right up to the edge. I don't want that overlocking tail to hang, and I don't want to just cut it because the bits will just hang out. So I've just looped that back in so that when I fold that seam back, there's not going to be any bits of thread or anything else sticking out. So overlocking, I started on one side. I went from the shoulder to the armhole, and now I'm going from the armhole to the shoulder. And the reason for that is that there is a right side for overlocking, and that is that this side, the top side, is the right side, and underneath is obviously the underside. And so when you fold overlocking back, you want the right side, not the wrong side, to be showing. So I'm going to fold those seams back towards the back, and that means that I want the right side of the overlocking to be on the top. So when I'm overlocking, say I'm taking the sides of trousers, on one side I'll start from the top to the bottom, on the other side I'll go from the bottom to the top, so that I've got the right side of the overlocking going backwards. Little things like that may not seem like much, but when your client turns the garment inside out and has a look and goes, oh my goodness, look how nice and neat that is. I take pride in that kind of thing. And of course, where it was just unpicked at the top of the armhole, that has to be re-overlocked and restitched. In this case, because the stitching is so close to the overlocking, I'm just going to do the overlocking, and then when I go back to the machine, I'll just stitch it closed. Now we're just going to thread the elastic. There's two things that I use for threading elastic. The one is that needle there with the big eye. I think they're called a carpet needle or something like that, or upholstery needle. You can find them in those packets that they sell with lots of different types of upholstery needles. And the other one is the bodkin, but in this case the bodkin, the little bit on it was too big to go into that section. So I'm just pinning at either end, and then I'll stitch it down, overlock it, and then turn that section back, because remember it was top stitched down so that it's out of the way, and I'll top stitch it down, and then the job is complete. So there was just one final thing with this, and that was when I was looking at it, I saw that the overlocking had pulled away at one section from the fabric. Now it's going to be almost impossible to say cut that off and then try and redo the rolled hem on it. You're not going to get it right. So what I thought was, I think I'll just stitch it back on again. It's a casual top. It's not like it's a dressy dress top. And so that's what I did. So I just hand stitched it, grabbed hold of the overlocking and just brought it in. Now it's not perfect, it's not invisible mending by any stretch of the imagination, but it's going to be hard to see by anybody who doesn't know where it is. You know, they're not going to notice it, and it's better than having it hanging down. So you can see there that it's very difficult to notice the overlocking that's been stitched back on. Ruth was very happy with the alteration. It is something a little bit different, and you know, maybe you've got a top similar and it's something that can help you with your clothes alterations. Happy altering!